Hey, hi, hello, I'm Jamali, and this will be the start of a new series on this channel that I'm going to be pouring my heart and soul into. This series will be called Looking Forward. It is a book review of a book by Edward Bellamy named Looking Backwards. It follows the abnormal circumstances of our protagonist, Julian West, and his grasping the weight of the America he lived in the year 1887 and what he has shown it will become in the year 2000. A fiction aimed to express what Bellamy envisioned to be the outcome of the political issues of class and economic policies that plagued his time. I will say that this book, while seeming to offer a lot of answers to our glaring problems societally, it does little to offer an answer to the more fundamental questions, which we'll be addressing as this series goes on. It does, however, do what I believe to be a wonderful job at highlighting the palpable disconnect between what is desired and what is reality in relation to the problem of how wealth is earned and held in our current system. Once again, I say that this book doesn't have concrete answers, but idealism and theories give birth to a system Bellamy imagined would be in place of capitalism, or as we'll refer to it as the competitive system going forward. So without further ado, let's hop right into it, starting off with the very thing we just mentioned, the competitive system. For the sake of context, it is important that we discuss the system, and I will alternate between calling it the competitive system and capitalism. Just keep in mind that when I'm saying competitive system, I'm talking about capitalism. They're interchangeable. I hope you enjoy this journey. We're gonna go on because it's gonna be a magical one. Herein lies the form of capitalism. The beginning of Looking Backwards is premised on our protagonist, Julian West, giving a brief dissertation at a university that he works at in the year 2000. He gives a description of the time he hailed from, 1890s Boston, and the mindset of some of his contemporaries, that being the wealthy, who would contest the idea that there was a way to solve the labor problems that plagued the 1800s because the working man would never be satisfied. And that is only because the working class toils, that the race itself doesn't starve outright. Their problem being unconsolable whilst the world as a whole remains so poor. The race being referred to here is the competitive model, by the way. Bellamy's example of a coach driven by hunger, with humanity harnessed to it and dragged toilsomely through hilly and sandy roads. Despite the difficulty of drawing the coach, sitting comfortably atop, desperately trying to hold on to their seats are people who have never got down to help. They climbed to the top, they meant to keep it, in order to pass it down to their offspring, as were the rules of this coach, and falling off the top leads you to being compelled to pull that wagon as your seat is wholly lost to you. This was an ever-dampening cloud over those who sat atop the coach, understanding that it could happen to you or your friends. And when it concerns them is only when the rough roads have caught the coach and is essentially making their seats more insecure, do they really actually discuss the well-being of those pulling. And as for those who actually manage to make it to the top, it's almost as if a hallucination falls over them. They forget what it was like to actually pull the coach before they even shed the markings of the rope that they pulled. It was a spell that worked very quickly in making you forget about the toilsome pulling and dragging through sandy roads and hilly land. And as for those whose grandparents and great-grandparents had secured their seat atop it, those beings had actually started to believe that they were of higher caliber of human, as if they were not human, but something better, as if they deserved to be at the top while the rest of humanity dragged toilsomely. They truly thought they were cut above the rest, a different breed, you might say. And while they would debate the difficulties of the road, if the passengers were secured and felt that neither of them or their friends would lose their seat, they would probably never speak about it. The idea of a fair system remained wholly elusive to the people of this time as per the book. Truly, they saw no other way as to run society, and philosophy forbade wasting compassion on what was beyond remedy. In parallel to this fiction, non-fiction US is actually going through a time period called the Gilded Age, coined by Mark Twain. A period that allowed one of the most corrupt times in our country's history. So much so that the biggest lender to the US government at one point was one man, J.P. Morgan. You've most likely heard of him. And while O.J. Pizzle was sleeping in a mansion in New York, immigrants and other poor slept in tenements, little buildings that were extremely small, often held behind other major buildings on the street. And I mean, there are no health code violations back then, but Jesus Christ, if there was. 7 to 8 people packed in a room about the size of my room, which isn't big. Another couple of names that might be familiar to you from this time period is one John D. Rockefeller and an Andrew Carnegie. Those guys, whom you've likely had some level of U.S. history in if you were born and raised in the U.S., all are from this time period. All of them became buku money rich at this time period for some pretty sus ways. For example, the use of cheap immigrant labor working dangerously without dangerous pay, so to speak. A common occurrence throughout the history of capitalist America, actually. And the entire world for all of history, actually. I only mean to highlight the moral atrocities that a system like this propagates by its very nature. The comparison is very apt of a coach being driven by hunger, and one that I believe truly highlights the inhumanity of the system in its earlier applications and even today a little. Labor strikes plagued the country towards the end of the 19th century. The Civil War was coming to a close and the country was moving towards industrializing and cleaning itself up for the world stage. I highlight this to give relevant information and in turn further insight into Mr. West's comparison and explanation of the competitive model. Okay, back to the fiction. It became prevalent that throughout most amongst the top that this unrest in common folk was leading to a dive off a ladder of progress and down into a state of anarchy. A cycle that has pervaded history and prehistory, that this cycle must account for the bumps on our human cranium. And the idea of indefinite progress in a right line was a chimera of imagination with no analog in nature, was a lot of the forethoughts of Mr. West's contemporaries, believing that there was no true solution to the labor problems that faced them, and that eventually anarchists would end society as we knew it until we could climb back up that ladder. Quite the cynical take from Mr. Bellamy, and sets up Mr. West's apprehension for the system he grew up in while he's giving this dissertation 100 years later after being hypnotized in his own basement mansion. Julian writes how this was an extreme view among his contemporaries. With all that's going on at the time, the labor troubles chiefly took hold of the reins in the minds of those on top. The cause, the course, and the cure were of pertinent discussions of the time. It certainly seemed as though great change was coming, for better or for worse. The world Julian finds himself in seems far removed from the days of 1890s America, though. The city of Boston had changed dramatically, in both appearance and character. Our protagonist, Julian West, wakes up in a new, unfamiliar place. There's a lot of subplot at the beginning of the book, as this is a fiction. Keep that in mind. He is greeted by A1 Dr. Leet, a man charged with explaining to Mr. West of his curious predicament. A lot of dialogue between the two is expositioning the difference in time Mr. West awakens in. Julian immediately chalks up his new environment to nothing more than an elaborate prank. Dr. Leet does his best to assure Mr. West that this is no mere prank, that he has indeed slept 113 years. He explains how he and his medical colleagues were baffled by the state of his entranced body and the state of which even his cells had ceased and preserved for over a century. Catching his image in a mirror, Mr. West finds his way to it and finds indeed he is not aged a single day, making his narrator's narrative harder to believe. The farce is going on too long and Julian's temper is rising. Dr. Leet asks if he's strong enough to follow him upstairs. Julian understandably threatens to show Dr. Leet just how strong he is, although the doctor's response is one of concern mingled with commiseration. It takes Mr. West back considerably that even under threat of physical violence, Dr. Leet, in a weird show of mannerisms, did not even seem the slight bit perturbed by Mr. West's comment. Instead, they walked upstairs to the balcony to look upon the Boston of the year 2000. And that is how Julian West learned his predicament was quite real as he looked upon Boston and he saw great change. Once Julian could come to terms with this predicament, he became eager to discuss his new surroundings and the seeming 100 years that have passed. One of his initial major things he noted just about the landscape was the lack of chimneys and smoke they produced. Keep in mind, this book was written in the late 1800s, and Bellamy is sort of already predicting that, coal and fossil fuels essentially are going to go out of business by this time. Dr. Leet exclaims himself here, recalling how that crude method of combustion that was used in West's time was obsolete. The method at this time of Bellamy writing this would be around 1980s, which means fossil fuels would be the crude method Dr. Leet was talking about. Julian is blown away by the material prosperity of the part of the people which its magnificence implies. Dr. Leet responds with earnest curiosity, wishing he could get a glimpse of Boston of Julian's time, remarking on how cities of that time were no doubt a shabby affair. That the general poverty that resulted from the industrial system would not have given them the means to do an otherwise better job at city building. Moreover, the excessive individualism which then prevailed was inconsistent with much public spirit. That the little wealth they had was almost wholly lavished in private luxury, adding that nowadays surplus wealth goes to adorning the cities so that all may enjoy it to equal degree, which accounts for all the public spaces, fountains, and otherwise decadent buildings that have altered Boston's landscape. A very interesting idea, one that I think we'll revisit when the time comes. We'll have to get to the nitty-gritty of how wealth in this world works and what it means to have a surplus. But like I said, as we go on, we will discuss that. After many hours of talking about the differences, dinner time follows. Mr. West is introduced to Mrs. Leet, a woman of equal age to the doctor, and their daughter, Edith Leet. She shares her name with Julian's now long dead fiancé from when he was going to get married back in 1887. It's a fiction. Here he notes the ingenious sincerity and frankness one would have with a long acquaintance, each person offering their own take on how he had been forgotten in his underground chamber. The layer of ash on top of the chamber suggests the house may have burned down. Having conferred with his host that he had likely been assumed dead by the fire, the grounds that his house previously occupied had been open ground for some time before anything else was built on it. Julian finds the distraction from thoughts on his surreally unique position welcome, knowing that at some point he must be alone with his own thoughts. As the night draws and the ladies retire, Dr. Leet and Julian discuss the Boston of the current year. Julian remembers the doctor telling him that the last century was marked with greater changes than many a previous millennium, eager to hear about the society over the last 100 years. How did we solve the Sphinx's riddle of the 19th century? The riddle being the labor question. He proposes that society would have deserved to be devoured if it could not answer such a simple riddle. Hindsight 2020, I guess? He goes on to say that the solution presents itself through the process of industrial evolution. All that society had to do was recognize and cooperate with the evolution when its tendency had become unmistakable. Julian fell asleep on May 30th, 1887. I believe that is the day before what is now known as Memorial Day, but it used to be called Decoration Day back then, remembering the fallen from the Civil War. Dr. Leet remarks on how even then Mr. West's companions could not see the crisis approaching society. The blindness shown by those at the time stunned historians of the year 2000. Dr. Leet, excited for this miracle of a historical perspective, asked Julian to explain more the view of men of his grade and intellect. Dr. Leet insisted Julian and his associates were aware of the industrial and social troubles, to which Julian confirms, saying, "We felt that society was dragging anchor and in danger of going adrift. Whether it would drift, nobody could say, but all feared the rocks." Out of fiction, real quick, I think it's important to note the direness in Julian's analogy. It's reminiscent of the initial analogy of the coach being driven by hunger. In this analogy, he uses a ship and an anchor to substitute the issues facing society at the time. It's both validating and somber that the issues of today were noticed and seen 100 years ago, if not more than that. A competitive system with a no-hold-barred incentive is just not the best idea. Dr. Lead also mentioned something that I just previously said about the idea of an industrial evolution. I take this to mean that technology advanced in a way that allowed for mass production to be more efficient. Remember, at this time, our protagonist, Julian West, is from the year 1887, a time in nonfiction America that saw the start of the Second Industrial Revolution, a revolution that saw a spike in mass production. We'll see if this is touched upon more further in the book. Back to fiction real quick before we wrap up this episode. Julian remarks that hindsight is better than foresight, which is a true, and that he is surprised he didn't wake up to discover a city of ruins. Julian shows a touch of impatience, but I think that's relatable considering that we haven't actually answered the question, the solution to the labor problem, the answer to the Sphinx's riddle. And in the next episode of Looking Forward, we'll get to just that as their conversation dives a little bit deeper into how this system that Julian finds himself in the year 2000 works. Thanks again for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time on Looking Forward.